Welcome back to Season 3 of Multifamily Unpacked. Today, my guest is Jerry Davis, the former COO of UDR. UDR is well known in the multifamily industry as a pioneer in all things centralization. In today's episode, we unpack how Jerry went about bringing that change to the industry and the lessons he learned along the way. My big takeaway is that leadership, culture, and embracing innovation is how they got there. But there's lessons, especially for this hard macroeconomic environment, that I think everybody will find useful. All right, so Jerry, I don't know if I came up with this, but I'm going to take credit for it that I've been calling you the godfather of centralization. I mean, so why don't you, for our listeners, give everyone a little bit of background on why you have an authoritative position and why anybody should listen to you on topics of multifamily operations. What's your background?
Well, thank you for that moniker that you've given me. I'd never heard it before, so I think you did come up with it. But I spent over 30 years at UDR, a publicly traded multifamily REIT. Currently has about 60,000 units. I started out as controller of the company back in 1989 and just jumped over to property management after about 10 years of doing accounting. I ran a portfolio in the western United States. In early 2000s, I was promoted to run operations at UDR. Got promoted up to chief operating officer and subsequently president. I ended up retiring from UDR at the end of 2001 after, again, 30 plus years. And for the last several years I was there, we focused quite a bit on centralization and improving the resident experience. So what we really came to realize as we looked at other places consumers conduct business was they prefer self-service. Whether it was airlines, banks, grocery stores, we saw that people didn't want to wait in line, that they didn't want to be sold to, that if you gave them the technology to do what they needed to do and access to people when they wanted people, that was the way they preferred to do business. So even pre-COVID, we started working on this back in probably 2017, 2018. We saw it as a way to transform the way we did business to meet customer wants. And the other thing we saw was there was a way it could make our operations much more efficient.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. Now I'm going to turn the clock back even further because you mentioned you came in to the industry as a controller, but you also specifically highlighted there that working for UDR, you had an operational role, and you specifically highlighted using technology to improve the customer experience. So if I take those kind of things, you're working at a REIT, which in the world of multifamily inherently means that they are a little bit more bottom line oriented. You yourself have a controller background, and you go out to the field, to the property management side on the operations over the West Coast portfolio. What were some of the technology challenges when you first went into multifamily? What was the state of technology when you started working on the operations side?
There was limited technology. When I first jumped over into ops in the late 90s, UDR had just started using email, for example. Something we all use today. There was no such thing as a CRM. We had just gotten into using rent rolls, actually automated product. We used to use Mylars prior to that, which was hand, you just write them out by hand. Everything was on paper. So really no technology. You didn't have cell phones back then. Faxes were still being used all the time. You didn't have dashboards to track any information. You would set your prices based on market rent surveys. I'd say you would do them in Excel, but most people didn't know how to use Excel back then. So you would do that by hand. You weren't changing rents with any frequency. You were keeping resident notes on sticky notes that were just all over the place. So there was limited to no technology when I first got into the ops side back in the mid-90s.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I think of everyone's career, we all are, you're coming into an industry, and obviously, Jerry, you've got a phenomenal success story, ultimately running operations for the 60,000 unit portfolio. What were some of the either operational or technology challenges that you personally were involved in that kind of helped, again, we'll get to centralization, and that was kind of the latter part of your career, but to me, UDR and some of the REITs have always been ahead of the curve at kind of setting the tone for multifamily standpoint, both in terms of technology, moving off of, manual paper processes, but also just operationally kind of raising that bar. So what are some things maybe looking back that you could tie your success in your career to?
I would say running the portfolio with data. We created dashboards within Excel before we had true dashboards through things like Power BI. We actually use those numbers to set goals, hold people accountable, and drive performance. And we had a consistency of what was expected across 150 to 200 properties that everybody understood. I would get up early every morning, extract data, put it out to the field to see. And I did that initially because I wanted to know how my portfolio was doing. Then I thought, wow, I should just share this with everybody else. And I didn't do it to shame the underperformers or put accolades on the top. It was just so people could see what could be done with either strategy or effort. So I would say that was a big thing. The other thing that I think made UDR different was we were very innovative. We were not afraid of change. We understood our business was to grow the value of the portfolio, so the stock price would go up. And a big part of doing that is keeping your residents happy. The other side is running an efficient organization. And, I used to say we would always look to do things that were good for the resident and good for UDR. So you were looking for other revenue opportunities that were beneficial to both. So whether it was providing storage, and you could provide storage to somebody for $50 on site that they would have to pay $100 to somebody else, but we still could monetize that and make money, giving people preference on where they parked. So we were one of the first to really introduce parking as an amenity and monetize that. When we saw how many people were using payday loans, we started allowing people to do biweekly rent payments for a nominal fee because so many of our residents, and it was optional, but we would charge a fee. And if people were going to a payday loan place, even in higher end properties, some people have cash management issues. If they're willing to do that, we could undercut that price by a significant amount. So, in tough times, you look for places where, you can preserve some of the residents' pocketbooks so they can keep it. It also opens it up for a little bit higher rent increases if you can cut other parts of the bill. So, today I know UDR is working on things like building-wide Wi-Fi that can drive down their overall cost, but it has other benefits to UDR. But I think the biggest thing about UDR is we were never afraid of change. So we had a culture of innovation, and we had an attitude that we were going to make it work. Nobody likes change. So the initial feedback you would get from residents, whether it was online bill paying, paying your rent online and closing off the rent drop boxes, everybody hated that for the first month or two. But then once they figured out if I was out of town and it was the first day of the month, I could just go online and do an ACH payment. So it made my life easier. I didn't have to walk, 3 blocks to the rental office to pay my rent. Once they got used to it, it was a better process, but you had to kind of drag them to the efficiency of what they wanted. And we just kind of learned nobody likes change, residents or your employees, but after they get used to it, if it's been well thought out and you have determined it's going to be a win-win, you just kind of have to stick by your guns. So don't just fold at the first sign of some resistance.
And that was some fantastic wisdom there. And it's interesting because, Jerry, you mentioned topics that you all at UDR took on in what others would have considered really good times. And I say that because now I see companies that are actually looking at those things because it is hard times. And I tie that together. Everybody's going to have to change. I think what you said is the attitude at UDR was, well, we're going to choose to change. We're going to lead in change rather than let it come to us. And I think that's a good segue into, the multifamily industry at large now is centralizing. Every owner operator, third party manager is figuring out how can we do this. You all did this a long time ago. And so I want to tie together something you previously said where you said, we had this culture of innovation, but we also used the data, right? So what were the indicators that made you all think that, hey, maybe there could be operations across multiple properties? And did you start small? Did you start big? And we know ultimately there were some big outcomes, but maybe kind of talk to us about the genesis at UDR of what I perceive to be a monumental operational mindset shift, but what told you needed to do it and where did you start?
Well, because we had that culture and we encouraged different different property management teams in our portfolio across the country to try new things. You would have somebody in Orange County, California, trying out doing all of the back office bookkeeping. So the tasks that a typical assistant community director would be doing, such as preparing FASs or collecting rents, setting fees, things like that, they started doing in a kind of a pod process in Orange County. So it would handle 4,000 units. And what they found is by giving tasks that aren't happening every day. So every time a manager would have to touch it, they would have to remember, how does that work again? But if you had one person that specialized in that, or 4 or 5 tasks, they could do it much more efficiently. The other thing we saw is you had managers that were making, let's just call it $75,000, $80,000, that were doing tasks that could be done by somebody making $50,000. So we kind of got to a mindset of have people do only work they can do, and anything that could be done by a lower level person is where it should be done. So you optimize kind of rate and workload like that, dollars drop to the bottom line. I'll give you one example. When I used to run the West, I operated my area. I was in a property in Phoenix. That's where our office was, because we were frugal enough to not pay for fancy office space. We would put ourselves in a 3-bedroom unit. So I was in there sharing it with 4 or 5 people. And I tended to get to work early in the morning. And I was sitting in my office, which was the master bedroom with a view of the parking lot. And I saw the service manager, the tech, and the porter walking the property picking up trash. So they all had their buckets and their pickers. And, it's 6:30 in the morning. And I know the service manager probably had the attitude, I wouldn't ask my guys to do anything I wouldn't do. And what I saw was a guy making $25 an hour, a guy making, and this was 20 years ago, a guy making $18 an hour, and a guy making $12 an hour, and they were all doing $12 an hour work. And while it made him seem like a more sensitive manager that understood the plight of his employees, I looked at it and thought, the guy's wasting $18 an hour of pay by doing things under his pay level. And a lot of the things we did at UDR is exactly that. So we created specialists in these centralized teams that would handle specific parts of the business, so they were much more efficient at doing it. And then the managers, the most experienced people, what we found with them is if you took a lot of the mundane, repetitive roles off of them that were below their pay scale, they could manage more property. So the real efficiency came when you either outsourced or centralized, that the managers, instead of running a 300-unit property, could now run 2, if not 3, 300-unit properties because they had all these centralized teams. And they would still get a pay pop, but it wasn't 3 times what they were making before. And those are the dollars that tended to fall to the bottom line for UDR as we went through this transformation.
I think often, again, why I am grateful that Funnel started working with REITs is that there is a bottom line mindset that forces you to be at the front of the innovator's curve. Because, we're having very similar conversations in the world of technology right now. There's a lot of technology companies that were highly inefficient, and the name of the game now, and whether it's, big organizations like Meta and Apple, or it's, startups like Funnel, it is, hey, how can we do this more efficiently, right? How can we deliver the same value in a more efficient way, deliver value back to the shareholders? But what you highlighted from both the cultural perspective and then in your tangible examples there is change management. And in particular, like you said, no one likes change. Renters don't like change. They don't want to pay online. But very, very specific, we really don't like change when it comes to our jobs. And so you talked about, certain roles being moved out of the organization. I'm curious, did that happen overnight? Was that through attrition? And then you also talked about creating specialist roles where you had higher compensation. So talk to us about that change management process of how you went from an organization that looked like everybody else in multifamily. I'm sure you started out with, assistant community managers, the 1-to-100 ratios. And by the end of it, UDR has an org chart that's incredibly unique. So how did that talk us through kind of that change management process and how you went about getting to the end state, which was a far more efficient organization?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We did have the typical 1 per 100 in the office, 1 per 100 in maintenance. And what we found is some of the lower entry level positions, whether it was leasing agents or lower level maintenance guys, their average tenure with the company was maybe 6 months. Everybody else once you had been with us and started to move up, you stuck with us a long time. But a lot of people try it out and they see it's not all fun and leasing bonuses. You have to deal with resident issues too, which can not at all times be enjoyable. What you found with this level of new associates typically touching our residents through the leasing process was they weren't highly experienced. So the outcome was a lot of times the tour wasn't all that great, and we wanted to more systemize it with a recurring level of experience. So again, I said the average tenure was, call it 6 months. We didn't flip a switch and transform the entire portfolio overnight. We did it over time. So we had a plan that would take a couple of years. As people would naturally leave UDR, we just wouldn't replace them. We would either do it through automation, outsourcing, or centralization. So we kind of paced ourselves like that. Our managers spend or were able to now cover multiple properties, and that's both on the office side as well as maintenance, because they had fewer employees. They could cover more properties. And by taking a lot of the recruiting, hiring process, training process, managing process off of them, you really took the HR, if you will, functions for the most part away from them, which was nice, and they could function on those activities that were more central to the customer. We looked at it and determined the cost of outsourcing and centralization with the cost of an employee on site. It's probably a push, but where the real money was made was at the top levels where the managers could handle multiple properties. And when you have 150, 200 properties and you can reduce your managerial headcount by, 30, 40%, that's where the dollars fall to the bottom line.
Yeah, that's massive. That's a huge change. And what's interesting now, and you think about this for individuals in any disruptive technology, is that, we get inquiries all the time. I have leaders reaching out saying, hey, we're looking for someone who has experience in centralization. And it's pretty limited. Anybody that, if the resume says 5+ years, I tell them you got to rewrite the JD, because those people only exist if they come from UDR. And so I think, to your point, there are the folks that embrace that specialized mentality. This is true of any organization. The folks that want to be in a culture of innovation, they tend to have more opportunities later in their career. Because I'll tell you right now, if somebody has portfolio sales manager in their title, oh man, they are in demand in multifamily, because they know how to work with tech. They know how to work, more efficiently. Now, you mentioned maintenance in there, and obviously Funnel Leasing, our full name. We don't focus on the maintenance side as much, but it is, in every survey I've seen, it seems to be the task that seems most difficult for operators to think about centralizing. So when you all thought about centralization, there's leasing tasks. You talked a lot about admin, back office, and there's maintenance. What was the approach with the maintenance centralization? How did you go about making progress there when, like you said, at the end of the day, they do physically have to be on site, versus some of those rules just genuinely don't even need to see the property? Yeah,
a lot of the maintenance, honestly, we did through outsourcing. If it was lower level, portering, picking up the grounds or turning units, we determined, let's just outsource that. It's sporadic at times. You want to get units turned as quickly as possible. And those were very high turnover positions, and we just wanted to put the managerial issue on somebody else. It still means our maintenance supervisors have to walk every unit, make sure it looks good, that we're walking the grounds to make sure they look good. But the accountability function was still there, but having the people was not. And, a lot of people look at outsourcing and see that the rates that people charge are like, well, I could pay a guy $15 an hour to do that, and they're charging me $21. When you look at a fully loaded cost, if you provide benefits, if you think about the PTO that people get, people really, you're usually looking at 2 weeks off plus two weeks of holiday pay and some sick pay. You're paying people 12 months of salary for 10 and a half months of work, frequently. Then in our industry, we all frequently give some level of rent discount, which also gets baked into that. But we saw that, especially for the lower level positions at UDR, our cost was about 150% of what their base pay was. So when you started comparing the 150% to what an outsourced cost is, that frequently doesn't have quite as good of benefits, it was about a push. So it wasn't as transparent as it appeared to be. So, one thing I would tell people is look deep into the numbers. There's a lot of hidden non-direct cost that if you start adding them up, it gets sizable. And that's when we really, made the determination to go that way. We still do, especially at proximate properties, have maintenance techs as well as supervisors that will bounce back and forth between communities.
Yeah, well, I think that's a brilliant concept. And I think in all things, that's, you really need to solve for the 90%. You need to solve for your high performers. And in a lot of cases, overstaffing inefficiencies in every organization, in fact, in every product, comes from trying to solve for every edge case. And I love what you said, that the remaining text that you kept, I mean, I can imagine if I'm in their shoes, if hey, you're doing less, but you're going to be doing the core work. You're going to be working when you want to work, and we're going to put our resources behind the things that are more on the periphery. The after hours smoke alarm won't stop going off, right? We'll get somebody else to handle that. All right, so Jerry, you were in the industry long enough that you probably lived through a few different cycles, and we certainly are in a headwinds type environment right now for multifamily. And so when you were talking about really looking into the numbers, I can tell you that our partners are really sharpening the pencils more than they ever have before. So looking at it now as the retired former COO of UDR, what is it about this moment in time that you could compare with other cycles? And are there any lessons of you talked about hard times really force you to innovate, but any lessons you can pull from your career in terms of when the markets are tougher and demand isn't as high as it was for what seems like the last decade?
Yeah, all cycles are different. You go back to 2007 and a lot of jobs went away. Right now we have full employment. Our issues today are just the cost of housing is very high for most people, whether it's renting or buying a home. Buying a home is just out of reach for the majority of our renter base. And you have to realize that with new supply coming on in a lot of the markets, especially in the Sun Belt, times are tough. Concessions are popping again, and you're fighting for every lease at the optimal price. You're trying to have your lease trade-outs not go negative on you to try to optimize renewal rates. But, you got to get back to the point where, rent growth of flat to 3% might be good, whereas 2 years ago, you're looking at double digits. So things swing. Times like this, you need to have been already preparing for these days. So the first thing I'd say is in the good times, and Tom Toomey, my old CEO at UDR, used to say this all the time, when times are good, you can't just sit around. You have to be planning for the bad times when they come. So a lot of the things you are doing in an incubator back in the corporate office, thinking through, plotting out, you need to be prepared to roll those out when times get bad, because that's the time you need to get more efficient. So you need to find ways to save, or you need to be able to offer new products to your residents and do, as I said earlier, roll things out to them that they're paying somebody else for that you can give to them at a better price and that's a better quality. So I would tell people if you haven't been thinking about it and you're in that stage right now, you're probably a little bit late. So next time you're in a good time, be preparing for the bad times always. But if you're at a time like this, I would say you should look at every position and determine what value do you get out of each one. Is there a better way to doing it through either technology, again, outsourcing, centralization, every one of those. But most of my career, we didn't have a lot of technology to lean on. So it was just brute force and muscle and changing policy and process and determining what needs to be done. I think you should go look at every policy you had done previously and determine if you still need to do it. I think you should go look at your website and see if it really answers the questions that need to be answered. Some people say all traffic is good traffic. I always said no, it's not after you've done a 40% site headcount, because they get overwhelmed if it's bad traffic. So you want to try to pre-self-screen as many people as you can on your website. So ask them questions like, do you have a prohibited breed dog? Do you make this much money? Because we require you to make 3 times the rent. And this is what the rent is. So you give them a calculator, because a lot of people can't do math in their heads. Things like that. And I'll tell you, I'll give credit where it's due. And it's to Fred Twomey and what he created when he was at Starwood Waypoint, which is now Invitation Homes. Fred was generous enough to let us come behind the scenes and see what he was doing, probably back in 2017, 18. At the time, I thought, Fred's got a dispersed portfolio. He has to be efficient. We don't. It took me a year or so to realize some of this stuff would work for our residents. And I went and looked at their website, and I saw how it asked a lot of questions before I could even set a tour. I had to go read a few things to answer pre-qualifying questions and doing things like that. So a lot of higher level people probably haven't looked at the content of their website. You'd leave it up to the marketing department or somebody lower to do. Go read through those things as a consumer, and you're going to have a lot of things to change that will improve your traffic flow and your efficiency. The biggest thing, though, make sure you know who your top performers are. This is a people business. It's real estate, but it's people driven. And at every level, your top performers aren't just, the C-suite guys. It's also the leasing agent that you've seen who's got a lot of high potential. He just needs he or she needs some time to grow into their full capacity. And you make sure that you give them a good path and you don't reduce their job or, eliminate their job. But you're going to need them when the cycle changes, and you just have to realize cycles come and go. The good times never stay. The bad times never stay. Everything's going to flip around, and in 2 years, we're going to be looking at great growth again. You need to change what you can without impeding your future growth. The biggest thing you can do is protect that most valuable resources, which is your people, and do what's right with your residents. So you can't go nickel and dime them or anything like that. That never feels good. None of us like it when it happens in other parts of our lives. So you need to take care of the two most important contingents, and that's your residents and your people.
Jerry, there's so much good advice in there for other operators to pull from. And I loved how you talked about that you all, you got to be preparing in the good times for the bad times. You need to start by, finding your best people. You need to start by looking at processes. I think it was fantastic advice, really thinking about what would the processes look like in a skinnier staffing model. I think far too many people do overwhelm their sites with traffic. And in a centralized, more efficient staffing model world, that is probably the last thing you want to do. So I want to ask you some questions, and I want to put you on your futurist hat. You did a very good job leading UDR in looking ahead of the curve. So Jerry, if you came back into the field of play today, you're going to unretire like Michael Jordan as an operator in an uncertain environment where we're not sure if interest rates are going to come down. We're not sure if insurance costs are going to adjust. And we're not sure, to your point earlier, exactly how all this new product coming to market is going to be absorbed. Where do I start? How do I begin to get off the back foot and be prepared for the future of multifamily and what feels like a somewhat tumultuous, uncertain time?
I think a lot of that depends on if I were to do that, and I have no plans to. Whatever organization I went to, what's their access to capital to do things like put in smart home technology? I think that was one thing UDR did that enabled it to really do everything on a centralized basis. And while the cost looked high on a per unit basis, the ROI on it, whether it was through what the residents were willing to pay for the ease of smart home technology or what we could accommodate through efficiencies with our workforce or through self-guided touring, it underwrote 4 different ways and had a huge IRR. So I would say you want to go with the smart home technology. I think, you definitely want to look at your workforce and determine the best way to make your residents' experience enjoyable and for the company efficient. So a lot of it, I would probably run the exact same playbook as I had at UDR. I do think AI is far better than it was when I left 2 years ago, and it's getting better exponentially every year. So I think it's going to become a more usable product than it was previously. I will tell you one thing we did at UDR that I probably wouldn't do again is, and you hear me talk about outsourcing quite a bit. We built our own CRM when I was at UDR. We did it because the existing CRMs could not do what we needed it to do. And I think our CTO at the time, he went the right direction. We wanted what we wanted, and it wasn't accommodated somewhere else. So we weren't gonna be satisfied with that. So we built our own. That's hard. It's labor intensive. It's costly. I think rather than always build your own, if there's a good or great product out there, I would probably cobble together other people's products or buy one suite if they were all best-in-class products. And I wouldn't spend as much time building. I think UDR's team did a very good job building a CRM, but we were great operators. We weren't software developers, and you need to know what your business is and don't get distracted by this other stuff.
Yeah, well, I obviously could not agree more with that. And though I do love the UDR technology team, I think that, yeah, partnering with best-in-class operators and best-in-class technology, that is the secret sauce. One last question about the future of multifamily operations before I do a speed round about Jerry. So UDR really pioneered the new operating model. You mentioned AI and how quickly that's advancing. In your opinion, is there still meat on the bone to change the operating model, or are we about as efficient as we're going to get? When you look ahead 5-10 years in multifamily, are we going full self-service, no one's on site, robots are delivering packages? I mean, how much more disruption is coming, or were we just really kind of outdated and now we're hitting the bulk of it here?
I don't think we're close to being done. I think there's technologies we haven't even thought about that are going to come. And we're going to learn from other industries as far as, you talk about robots doing deliveries, robots vacuuming, the hallways in the middle of the night. That's much more efficient. I think there's plenty of stuff like that. I think one of the big things, you can swing too far one way or the other. You've got to be convicted about what you think the centralized and outsourced model looks like. But then I think after you implement it, you need to go back a couple years later with fresh eyes and say, what would we change? What did we screw up? And sometimes there's a pride of authorship that you're like, oh, we're so great. We did everything right. No, we didn't. And you need to go back and reassess. And I think when you centralize, you need to make a determination. Do you centralize to one national location, or do you centralize by market so that there's a little market expertise in there for the salespeople and they can understand the physical assets better because they can get out there on some level of frequency? And I think you need to look and retweak those things. So those are things, if I was still at UDR, I would be going in with a red team to say, hey, here's everything wrong with what you did in centralization, and not be afraid of reconstructing things you did. I believe in Scrum, and I think you need to go fast and then be willing to change and not be so rigid that it's my idea and I'm never wrong, so don't anybody try to mess with this thing. And I think you need to listen to others. You need to see what your peers are doing. UDR was the first that was rolling out self-guided tours, but then when COVID hit and everybody had to do it, I can tell you I've gone to many of UDR's competitors and done self-guided tours and looked at the process. And, I think you need to go with the attitude more of not, oh, we're better than them because they screwed up this and this and this. You need to go out to each one of these and try to find one or two things each one of them do better than you, and then change your model. So that's probably the biggest thing. But I don't think it's done. I think, like I said, there's some technology out there that we haven't even dreamed of yet that's going to come.
Of moving renters online, and I was at Property Solutions in some of the earlier days, and just establishing websites was kind of V1 of the internet era for multifamily. But now those same websites are leveraging AI in ways that we couldn't have thought about 10-15 years ago. And I agree that V1 of centralization, probably 10-15 years from now, we won't even talk about, because that just will be the operating model. You just will be more efficient, but leveraging that plus smart home plus AI, et cetera, that's the exciting world. Well, Jerry, this has been a lot of fun. I obviously am very passionate. I'm very grateful for the work that you've done in the industry. So just a couple of kind of maybe more personal questions we want to finish up with. So, usually we ask this to people who have not formally retired, though you're a very busy guy for a retired. So, in addition to advising Welltower, what are your hobbies, your social, your philanthropic things? What keeps you busy now as a semi-retired former multifamily executive?
I mean, we travel quite a bit. I split time between Phoenix and Orange County. I have a place in Huntington Beach also. It's a UDR
place,
property,
right?
and it's awesome. I spend a lot of my non-work time on pickleball, which I'm an addict to pickleball, so I'm very involved in that. I've got 4 kids, 2 live in Seattle, 2 in Phoenix, so I do quite a bit with them. But, I've tried to read more. I used to just read things that were related to my job because it was an all-consuming job. And now I'll read some fiction just for pleasure. I'll read some other psychology or behavioral science type literature, which I find interesting, whether it's Adam Grant or somebody like that. I listen to a lot of podcasts, I love Tim Ferriss, for example. He's probably my favorite podcaster, other than you. And, I just enjoy time. I live in a 55 plus community, so I'm very involved there when I'm back home in Phoenix. But yeah, I've got a full life, and I enjoy what I do. And as far as philanthropic, I guess if there's two things that are close to me, one, I've got a daughter and a daughter-in-law who are both elementary school teachers. They've both done Title I work with, lower income. So I'm very supportive of education, especially in those early years in inner city schools. And I've also been close to some people with substance abuse issues, and I'm very big into recovery for that.
Yeah, you and I, we have both those things in common. I've come from a family of educators and I've been in and around the program. So those are wonderful causes. And in addition, Jerry, it's very clear to me your participation with RET, you give back a lot. It's very clear your experience, you do not, you give generously. And I've seen that firsthand. So I'm grateful for that experience. All right. Well, if we had, I've got a billboard here in Tampa. And if I were to say, Jerry, I want you to put an opinion on this billboard, it can be personal, like in Arizona, make sure you bring your water, or it could be multifamily related, like 1 to 100 is dead. What opinion are you going to put on my billboard out here, Jerry?
It's funny. You had prepped me with that question. I was thinking, and I've got a couple, but I'm going to stick with the one that's more G-rated. And this is actually, it's funny. I think in my high school senior yearbook, we had to write something similar to this next to our little picture. And going back to 1980, it really hasn't changed. My favorite baseball player when I was growing up was Pete Rose. And, they called him Charlie Hustle. And he had a saying, hustle makes it happen. And that was what I was in my yearbook. I would say the same thing. I always felt like I was an average guy in every respect, but I was gritty. And I would do what it took to succeed and to win. And I wasn't afraid of change. And I think about a Pete Rose who would dive head first into third base. He would run people over if that meant scoring. He went from being an all-star second baseman to an all-star left fielder to an all-star third baseman to an all-star first baseman through his 25 years in the game. He was adaptable, and he saw the need for change because his skill set would go down and he would change. And I've always been somebody, I like to grow a little every year. I like to win. I like to compete. I like to do it fair. I don't know if Pete was always fair, but I do like to do it fair. But yeah, I would say hustle makes it happen, covers a lot of things. And, it's always meant something to me.
I like that. Hustle makes it happen. That sounds like something a software company would put on a t-shirt. I might need to make that happen and give you credit for that. All right. Well, last one. So, our tagline here at Funnel is renter centric. In your experience at UDR or now, as a renter yourself, what does it mean to be renter centric?
I think it just means focusing on your renter's needs. It's what makes their life better overall. And they should be the priority. I saw a lot of people in multifamily that is, it's a tough job. You get beat up for a lot of things as an employee that aren't your fault. And it's easy to see it or think at times your customer is your enemy. And when they walk in the door, you're like, oh, it's them again. What do they want? And I think you need to see every issue as an opportunity to change their mind and opinion and to make their life better. So I think you need to focus on your renter's needs instead of always, if you do that, your bottom line's always going to be okay.
Yeah, love it. Very true. Well, Jerry, thank you for your time. Really, really appreciate it, and hope folks enjoy this podcast. All right, we are so grateful for our listeners. And for those of you who enjoy the show, I would encourage you, please follow Funnel, follow myself on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Please send us an email or a voice message to marketing@funnelleasing.com. Maybe we'll respond to it on the show. But most importantly, we'll continue the conversation about how to make this industry better. Thank you.